Our guest for this episode is the renowned Russian translator Robert Chandler. He delves into the world of celebrated Russian writer Teffi, discussing his translation of the recently released short story compilation, The Time Was No More and Essential Stories and Memories Penned by Teffi. Robert first began learning Russian when he was 15. At 20, he spent a year as a British Council exchange scholar in Voronezh, the city where Andrey Platonov was born and where Osip Mandelstam was exiled. It was there that he first read these two writers who have remained precious to him throughout his life. He has also translated Sappho, Teffi, Alexander Pushkin, Vasily Grossman, the Uzbek novelist Hamid Ismailov, and the greatly undervalued poet Lev Ozerov. Like Grossman, Ozerov was a Russophone Jew born in Ukraine. He has edited and co-translated anthologies for Penguin Classics of Russian poetry and Russian short stories. He has also run translation workshops in London and taught for an annual summer school. He has worked as a mentor to younger translators. Before deciding to translate full-time, he worked for 8 years as a teacher of the Alexander technique, a valuable discipline concerning voice, breath, and movement. To buy the book And Time Was No More and Essential Stories and Memories, you can use the link given in the show notes. You may please follow and review our podcast on Spotify and Apple podcasting apps. When and how did you come across Teffi's work?
In the early 2000s, I was compiling an anthology of short stories for Penguin Classics, Russian short stories, 19th and 20th century. The 19th century stories I chose were nearly all very standard classics. The Queen of Spades, Gogol's The Great Coat, and so on. I read lots of other stuff, but it seemed obvious to me that the best-known stories actually were the best, and those were the ones I wanted to include. With the 20th century, it was exactly the opposite. I really still feel there's a huge amount we don't know about 20th century Russian culture. And there was certainly, at least, I asked lots of people for advice, both Russians and English. And there were at least 2 names mentioned by quite a number of people of writers whom I actually absolutely did not know at all. One was Leonid Dobrychin, who a rather minimalist writer who wrote in the 1920s and 30s. He only wrote very little. And the other name that was mentioned by a lot of people was Teffi. And it took me a while I asked for, she wrote a huge amount. All of it's amusing and entertaining. Some of it is great, but she wrote a lot. She was a professional who had to write every week. She had to publish a story every week or an article for her living. It's not all of absolutely equal value. Anyway, I was convinced that she deserved to be included. That was my first encounter with her work. And gradually over the years, I grew to admire her more and more. And she has a very unpretentious way of writing. It's very easy to underestimate the depth of her work. So it was really often only as I was translating her stories that I realized quite what a great writer she is.
How do you compare her work with Chekhov's?
She's got several similarities with Chekhov, I think. Chekhov also began as a light humorist, earning his living from writing for very large audience newspapers. Vasily Grossman praised Chekhov for being the first Russian writer to really bring people from every class, every faith, every profession into his work. He praised Chekhov as the first true Russian democrat. That's in Life and Fate. And I think much the same could be said of Teffi. She writes with deep sympathy of a illiterate peasant woman in the war receiving news of her son's death in the First World War and being utterly unable to understand it because she just has no grasp of what the First World War entails. There are characters from a great many professions. She writes in every possible tone. She writes very, at least as black as the blackest of Beckett in some of her Civil War pieces. She has a deep religious faith, or some very moving evocations of the feelings of the Orthodox. Yeah, I think she's got a lot in common with Chekhov.
See, you have translated 4 compilations, short story compilations. This is the 4th one. And you also translated an an autobiographical novel written by Teffi. Can you tell us about that novel?
She actually only wrote one novel in her life, which I still haven't read. It's called Adventure Novel. The other book which I've translated other than her stories the title is Memories, and we've given it a subtitle, From Moscow to the Black Sea, I think. It's her account of her journey across Russia and across the disintegrating Russian Empire. So from Moscow to the port of Novorossiysk, where she catches a boat that will then take her to Constantinople. So it's that's a memoir. It's not, I would say it's probably about 95% factually true. And that's often seen as her single greatest work. I think that may well be true. It's very remarkable. Almost every paragraph is both funny and tragic at the same time.
What sets this recent collection of stories apart from other story collections of hers which you have translated earlier?
Some of the books we've translated have been our initiative, and this particular one, the initiative was more from the publisher. They wanted to include Teffi in the series that they have been doing for several years of essential stories by different writers. So it's their initiative, but I wanted to find a way of giving the book a kind of rationale of its own. And I realized that since Teffi was, a lot of her stories are at least semi-autobiographical, that we could use it to give a kind of picture of her life story as a whole. So I've ordered it not according to the chronology of when she wrote a particular piece, but according to the story of the time in her life that the story is about. So it begins with a story of her as a 6-year-old, and it ends with a kind of stream of consciousness evocation of herself in a kind of opium haze during her, not her final illness, but a severe illness about 2 years before her death.
You have been teaching and running workshops about writers and Russian literature. You translated. How far do you think teaching helped you in translation? Talking about these translations with students.
I realized a while ago that one of the joys of teaching translation is that there probably aren't many areas of teaching where even someone who has been working in a field for a long time, as I have, can get entirely new understandings from their students. I don't think if I was an astrophysicist that I'd be likely to have 17-year-old students coming up with an idea which never occurred to me before. That does happen with translation. Complete beginners may come up with something. There are so many thousands of choices to make with every sentence. A beginner may well come up with a word which had just never occurred to you for a particular sentence. I've used Teffi a huge amount in my teaching of translation, largely because she appeals to such a wide variety of people. And she doesn't very often write extremely long sentences where people get completely bogged down and it takes forever to explain the syntax. Her Russian is very idiomatic, so it's a kind of good way of teaching people about Russian word order and so on. I've had some That was a very lovely experience, which I often quote when I was a little bit nervous about one. It was a daytime workshop, 4 hours, and there seemed to be very few people, unusually few people were booking for it. And two of them were Russian native speakers, which for the main part I'm teaching translation into English, so it's not ideal to have only Russian native speakers. But it ended up with two women, two Russian native speakers who were both women in their 50s, and a boy and a girl who were both still at school. I don't very often get 16 or 17-year-olds, but this time I did. And the 17-year-old girl in particular was obviously very gifted indeed. And I remember there was a sentence we were struggling with which I'd struggled with for some time. It's a story about a group of about half a dozen people. It's a small pilgrimage. They're crossing a bog to a monastery. It's a rather dangerous bog. They're walking along a very narrow sort of wooden walkway, and one of them gets frightened. And there's a description. Teffi uses quite a number of adjectives about this sort of evil-looking, dark, sticky liquid that the character might fall into. And we were struggling with the different adjectives. It's difficult to come up with 3 different adjectives to describe a bog that are all interesting. And I forget just what Teffi's words were, but I remember this girl, whose name is Sophia, her mother is Slovak, I think. This young Sophia came up with the word treacle, as in treacle, the treacle being this kind of black sugary liquid. And it was just such a perfect word because it conjures up the consistency of the bog, conjures up the colour. Clear with a long E is very close to trickly, as in water trickling somewhere. So it was just such a perfect word in every way, and I immediately wanted to use it, and I knew I would use it in the translation. But it's also very nice to be in a position to give that degree of encouragement to a beginner, to show genuinely that one really does value what they are saying.
Now, you have been co-translating with Miss Elizabeth Chandler for a while. How did you start translating with her, and tell us about that experience of co-translation with her?
That too developed gradually. Like most translators, I sometimes get completely stuck with trying to find a good English expression, and I'll seize on anyone who's around to ask, how would you say this? And so I would often ask my wife, and she's got a very vivid imagination, a rather more visual imagination than I have. She sees things like a film in her mind more clearly than I do. And she's also got a very good sense of rhythm. And she was often coming up with good answers. So I would gradually ask her more and more questions. And then it developed into something more formal. And then her multiple sclerosis got worse. And we realized that it was very enjoyable for both of us to work together, to spend more time working together. And we developed this system. She has the ability to hold a sentence in her mind without being able to look at it. She doesn't need writing. She's got a good ear. And so she would lie down and I would just read to her. And sometimes I would read a whole paragraph without either of us stopping. But a lot of the time we would be discussing each sentence and different variants of the sentence backwards and forwards between us until we felt happy with it. Or, sometimes we might realize we weren't getting anywhere and we were just going round in circles, and it'd be best to leave it till the next day.
We interviewed Hamid Ismailov, and you translated his novel Railways, and he had very nice words to say about your translation. I recollect he does something very similar. He reads it aloud to his wife and they keep correcting it. Something very similar.
It was very enjoyable to work with Hamid. It was quite a long time ago. And there are a lot of very funny jokes in The Railway. And humor is always the thing that most easily gets lost in translation. He and I and Elizabeth together would do a lot of work trying to get his jokes to be as funny in English as they are in Russian. And I think we succeeded in the end.
Now we'll move on to the current collection that you recently translated. I guess about 10 days ago it was released. And Time Was No More, Essential Stories and Memories. We picked up 3 stories for discussion. You picked up 3 stories for discussion. First one is, of course, the very humorous and lovely story, Kishmish.
Yes, this is it's a very touching story. It seems, on the face of it, quite slight. It's just about a 6-year-old and her name, Kishmish, is a nickname that she's been given, which she doesn't like. Kishmish is the name of a Caucasian name for a kind of raisin. And she's been given this nickname because she's very small and she's unhappy about that. So she fantasizes about ways in which she can become strong and powerful. And she has different ideas. Maybe she could become a famous brigand, but brigands often end up being executed. So maybe it'd be better to be an executioner, because the executioner gets the last word. And then she ends up thinking that maybe the best thing of all would be to be a saint. That would really be a way of being powerful. And it's very funny, but Teffi's religious preoccupations are already present in this story of herself, aged 6. And so I'd like to read a passage about her saint fantasies. Oh, if only she could get to be a saint. How marvelous that would be. So beautiful, so fine and sweet. To be a saint was above everything and everyone. More important than any teacher, head mistress, or even provincial governor. But how could she become a saint? She would have to work miracles. And Kishmish had not the slightest idea how to go about this. Still, miracles were not where you started. First, you had to lead a saintly life. You had to make yourself meek and kind, to give everything to the poor, to devote yourself to fasting and abstinence. So how would she give everything to the poor? She had a new spring coat. That was what she should give away first. But how furious Mama would be. It would be a most unholy row, the kind of row that didn't bear thinking about. And Mama would be upset, and saints weren't not supposed to hurt other people and make them upset. What if she gave her coat to a poor person, but told Mama it had simply been stolen? But saints were not supposed to tell lies. What a predicament. Life was a lot easier for a brigand. A brigand could lie all he wanted and just laugh his sly laugh. How then did these saints ever get to be saints? Simply, it seemed, because they were old, none of them under 16, and many of them real oldies. No question of any of them having to obey Mama. They could give away all their worldly goods just like that. No, this clearly it wasn't the place to start. There was something to keep till the end. She should start with meekness and obedience, and abstinence. She should eat only black bread and salt, and drink only water straight from the tap. But here, too, lay trouble. Cook would tell on her. She would tell Mama that Kishmish had been drinking water that hadn't been boiled. There was typhus in the city, and Mama did not allow her to drink water from the tap. But then, once Mama understood that Kishmish was a saint, perhaps she would stop putting obstacles in her path. And then, how marvellous to be a saint. There are so few of them these days. Everyone she knew would be astonished. Why is there a halo over Kishmish? What? Didn't you know? She has been a saint for some time now. Heavens, I don't believe it. There she is. See for yourself. And she would smile meekly as she went on eating her black bread and salt. Her mother's visitors would feel envious. Not one of them had saintly children. So do you want to say anything yourself about what you found difficult or what you found new in the story as you were working on it?
I felt something really strange. Though it's a story about an 8-year-old or a 6-year-old, I felt Teffi's like me. I have the same dilemmas even now Teffi had when she was 8-year-old. Such a lovely, wonderful story. Very beautifully picked up the dilemma of an 8-year-old. And I was wondering while I was reading the story for the first time, I was wondering at any point of time, did she want to be a writer? But there is no trace of writing anywhere. She wants to become saint or a brigand.
Yes, good point. Maybe there's an obvious answer to that, which is that she was quite a large family, and nearly all of them were writers of one kind or another. She had an elder sister who was quite a well-known poet. So being a writer wouldn't really have been a way of being more powerful than the other members of her family.
No, the other world. Other world is an interesting story. Again, I believe Mark Twain had a very similar experience. And she also talks about Ivan Bunin having a similar experience of getting their obituary read by themselves.
Teffi is still greatly undervalued, even though her work is being translated into a lot of languages now, and still isn't a well-edited, complete collection of all her works. There are probably still quite a few stories that were published in Paris in the second half of the 1920s and 30s, which may well not have yet been republished. And this particular piece, The Other World, very few people know it. It's been published in a small collection of proceedings from an academic conference in Russia. It hasn't been republished in any of the Russian language collections of her work. This is actually its first publication in a proper book for the general reader. It's a very fine example of Teffi's ability to present a situation from an unusual perspective. Obviously, during the war years, so she spent the war in Paris. She was in German-occupied Paris during nearly all of the war. At some point, I think in 1943, there were rumors got around that she had died, and her obituary was published in a Russian language journal in the States. And she heard about this, and in August 1945, she published this piece in a Paris Russian language journal. And it begins with her saying that she's heard about her obituary, and she puzzles over what is the correct etiquette for writing to an editor to say that one is still alive, that there is no correct established etiquette. Maybe there will be an etiquette for this, she says, because there are a lot of us who may be not quite sure whether we're still dead or alive. And then she's using this situation to say what life has been like for her at present and during the last few years. She's using it to give a sense of her life in occupied Paris. So she starts to explain both about the kind of personal, relatively minor difficulties of having much food, not having any heating, having to get through the winter without heating when one's got serious health conditions. So beginning with personal matters like that. And she keeps sort of fantasizing about perhaps this is the other world. And there are so many things that are different about life now. Who knows? And then she ends up by, in the last page, she's saying how, but even in the other world, they want to provide us with entertainment. So they take us to the cinema. But what do we see in the cinema? And she doesn't actually use the words Auschwitz or Majdanek, but it's entirely clear to the reader that what she's seeing in the cinema are Soviet newsreels, because it's a Red Army that liberated both Majdanek and Auschwitz. What she is seeing is the Soviet newsreels about the German death camps. And so she is using this relatively silly occasion of discovering her picture being published. She's using it to sum up everything most important about a life at that time, about life and death at that time in 1945. So it ends up on a very dark note indeed.
The third one is And Time Was No More. In fact, out of the collection, And Time Was No More and Rusalka, these are the two stories I really loved.
And Time Was No More is it's unusual even in her. For her, I don't think there are other examples of stream of consciousness. She is in a, it's spoken as if by a narrator who is in a state of delirium, and at moments she's recounting dreams. She's speaking to this dream figure called the huntsman, and it veers from childhood memories to deep philosophical reflection, and including her sort of ideas, her feelings about religion. I'm not sure, I'm hesitating slightly because I'm not quite sure religion is the word, but she philosophizes to this huntsman about her belief in a world soul. And I realized really just the other day, because I was reading this for a talk I was giving at Pushkin House in London, I realized that Teffi always has the ability to find some vivid detail, what the poet Ezra Pound called a luminous detail, to exemplify what she's talking about. So even when she's talking about something relatively abstract like the world soul, her work never dissolves into boring abstraction. She's always able to find a detail to exemplify it. The page I'd like to read from this story is how she manages to find a way of talking about the world soul in a kind of vivid, memorable way through the right detail. This dream figure called the huntsman asks her, and remember she's close to death at this point, "How have you overcome your fear of death?" he asked, with a strangely mocking smile. "By reason or by faith?" "Me? Through my theory of a world soul, a single soul, common to all people and animals, to every living creature. It is only the ability to be aware of this soul, and above all to give it expression, that varies according to the physical makeup of the creature in question. A dog can distinguish between good and evil every bit as well as a human being can. But a dog, of course, can't put any of this into words. Anyone who has carefully observed the life of animals knows that the moral law is inherent in them, just as in human beings. Which reminds me of a certain little hare, a silly little woodland creature. Someone caught this hare, and it soon grew tame. It liked to stay close to its owners, and if they quarrelled, it always got terribly upset. It would run back and forth between the two of them, and it wouldn't calm down until they made up. The hare loved its friends and wished them to have a peaceful life. This was for their sake, not for the hare's, because their quarrels did not affect it directly. What upset the little wild beast was the suffering of others. The hare was a bearer of the world soul. This is how I feel about the world soul, and this, therefore, is how I feel about death. Death is a return to the whole, a return to the oneness. This is how I see things myself. This has been my important illumination. There's nothing mathematical about it, certainly nothing that can be proved. For some people, the concept of the transmigration of souls has been an important illumination. For others, the illumination that matters has been that of life after death and redemption through the eternal torment of remorse. For others still, like my old Nyanya, nanny, what mattered most was devils with pitchforks. But I'm telling you what has been important for me. I doubt if anyone has ever written so simply and vividly about these kind of profound and difficult ideas. I'd like to mention, just by way of tangent, that we once had a cat. It was a very unusual cat. It was extremely large for a female cat and really rather badly coordinated for a cat. But emotionally, this cat, Billy, was very sensitive indeed. And she actually once intervened in a row between me and my wife. We were shouting at each other. And she intervened in almost exactly the same way as this hare. This particular image is particularly important to me for that reason.
Yeah, it is something, this story is to something very similar to that is The Other World. Some very common experience that people go through. She's in the bed and she has taken morphine and she's in a state of delirium and she starts writing about it and takes it to a whole different level altogether. Something very similar happens in this story too.
Absolutely.
And there are certain sentences, as if at the end of the story, when I read it for the second time, the story, I was wondering whether she was indicating about her philosophy of life or her philosophy of writing, in the sense that there are certain really beautiful sentences. She says that I would love to read a couple of them. One is, I have always known and I have often said that happiness isn't a matter of success or achievement. Happiness is a feeling. It's not founded on anything. It can't be explained by anything. Such a lovely way to put it across.
Yes.
One more really telling sentence for me, she says that one can escape the terror of life with religion, science, art, love, and death. I felt she is trying to escape the terror of her life through art by writing.
Yes. Very profound.
What are you currently working on, Robert?
We're almost finished with a compilation of the articles that Vasily Grossman wrote for the army newspaper Red Star between 1941 and 1945. He worked as a frontline reporter throughout that period. He witnessed an extraordinary amount. He's spent more time in the front line of Stalingrad than any other reporter. 18 months later, he was writing about Treblinka. He published one of the very first articles, long article. He interviewed survivors, interviewed local peasants. He did an extraordinary job of kind of reconstructing how the kind of psychological apparatus that the psychological apparatus that enabled the Nazis to such a small number of SS to manage the camp, for such a small number of SS to murder so many people. So he was dealing with these emotionally terribly burdensome matters. That's a monstrous understatement. He clearly did have some kind of nervous breakdown after writing about Treblinka. He was Jewish himself, and his own mother was shot by the Nazis. And then he was back with the Red Army as they were crossing in Warsaw and crossing the border into Germany, and in Berlin. Interestingly, in Berlin, the two places he writes about most that he visited personally were the Reich Chancellery. So he went into Hitler's office, saw papers and books scattered around. And he visited the zoo, which is a less obvious place to visit. And he talked to an old zookeeper and the keeper of the monkey house there. So that's a kind of just an indication of Grossman always seeking out the unexpected perspective, and that he uses that conversation with the monkey house keeper as the basis for a story that he wrote many years later, a kind of evocation of what Berlin was like during the war years. So this collection really does give you a sense of the enormous journey that Grossman went through himself, what he witnessed personally. Very few people have witnessed so much and really taken it in at a deep level. So it's, of course, he was writing for publication in an army newspaper. Of course, there are moments that are propagandist and things he couldn't say. Nevertheless, he managed to say an extraordinary amount. Certainly he is one of the great war reporters of all time.
You have done some wonderful work of translating Vasily Grossman and Andrey Platonov. If someone wants to start reading these two writers, what is your recommendation? Which are the novels that they should pick up in the case of Vasily Grossman and Andrey Platonov?
Grossman's probably always going to be best known for his long novels, Stalingrad and Life and Fate, and there certainly are absolute masterpieces. But some people feel intimidated by the length of these novels and do love what he wrote during his very last years. Everything Flows is a short, very unusually structured novel, which in some ways covers even more ground than Life and Fate. It covers the whole sweep of Russian history. And there's some wonderful short stories that he wrote during his last 18 months. And we've published some of those in a collection titled The Road. They're a little unexpected for Grossman. There's one, for instance, called The Dog, which is about it's a fictionalized account of one of the first dogs to be sent on a satellite into space. And one of my friends, not knowing very much about Grossman, I gave it to her to read, and she thanked me and said it's really shamanistic. And I thought, yes, of course, she's right. But I'm so used to thinking of Grossman as being a rather sensible and rationalist writer, a bit like George Orwell. But to think of him as being shamanistic was unexpected. But those short stories, The Dog, The Road, and the story titled absolute masterpieces. They are certainly on the level of Life and Fate. For those who don't want to read a long novel, that's what I would recommend. And for Andrey Platonov, he's still best known for his novels, The Foundation Pit and Chivingur, which are both, especially The Foundation Pit, is quite difficult reading. The style is very strange, and the subject matter, total collectivization of agriculture, and the deaths that entailed is very dark. A lot of people start off their reading of Platonov with the foundation pit, and sometimes it puts them off. I actually recommend his later work. So there's a story called The Return. We've published that several times. We included it in the book of the anthology of Russian short stories that we published for Penguin Classics, Russian short stories from Pushkin to Buida. The Return is his account. It's a Russian army captain returning home at the end of the Second World War. And like hundreds of thousands of men, his homecoming wasn't easy. This man comes home and there's a sort of 10-year-old boy who's used to being the boss of the house and hasn't seen his father for 4 years, and their relationship is a bit awkward. The wife may have been, it's not quite clear, but she may have been mildly unfaithful to him, so that's difficult. They have a row in the night. The husband thinks to hell with all this and gets on a train to leave because he is thinking of a younger woman whom he met on the train coming home, and he's thinking that maybe a kind of fantasy life with her, which the life he's fantasizing about with her might be more fun than being with this difficult family. And at the last moment, seeing these two children, which he slowly realizes are his own children, running towards the level crossing. The train is still only going 1 or 2 miles an hour, so just left the platform. He ends up getting off the train and understanding that perhaps the kind of real difficult life that he will have with his family might actually be richer than the kind of fantasy that he's been having about this young woman. So it's a very funny story. It's very tender, and it's very wise. And I'm sure it embodies the feelings of a huge number of people, not only Russians, but everyone returning home after difficult circumstances to families that they haven't seen for a long time. A very humane story indeed. And another of the remarkable things about it is that he writes in such a way that depending on what one has been through oneself, one can identify with all of the different figures in the book, in the story. I heard from a Jewish friend of mine that he loves this story very much, and he'd sent it to a friend, and the friend absolutely unhesitatingly and unthinkingly, he described it as he saw it from the point of view of the young boy, and he described it as a story about a young boy who, like me, was forced into maturity at an unusually early age. So the person who said that was a Jew who had survived the war in Poland. He'd survived the war as a child in Poland. He saw it it just didn't occur to him that this was a story about either a husband or a wife having a difficult relationship with their partner. He saw it as a story about a young boy having to deal with extreme difficulties at a very early age. That was a very interesting indication of the kind of universal appeal of this particular story.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for your time and, of course, for your wonderful illumination on Teffi's writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.